You're sitting in a room full of America's elite military aviators, combat veterans who've flown through enemy fire, test pilots who've pushed aircraft to their limits, and decorated officers with decades of flight experience. The question echoes through the briefing room like a challenge thrown into the wind. Any Apache pilots present? Silence. These were men who had conquered the skies, who had earned their wings through blood, sweat, and countless hours of training. Men who could fly anything with rotors or wings. Yet when it came to the most feared attack helicopter in the world, the AHD-64 Apache, not a single hand went up. The Apache wasn't just any helicopter. It was a flying tank, a machine so complex that it required two highly trained pilots working in perfect harmony. It was equipped with weapon systems that could level buildings, sensors that could see in complete darkness, and flight computers more sophisticated than those used to land on the moon. Most importantly, it demanded a level of skill that pushed even the most experienced pilots to their breaking point. But in that moment of absolute silence, when it seemed like the mission might be called off, when defeat hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, something extraordinary happened. A hand slowly rose from the back of the room, not the weathered hand of a grizzled veteran, not the steady grip of a seasoned test pilot, but the smaller, more delicate hand of someone who wasn't supposed to be there according to the old rules of warfare. Captain Sarah Chen had been waiting her entire military career for this moment, though she never could have imagined it would come like this. What followed would not only change the course of a critical mission, but would shatter every assumption about who belonged in the cockpit of America's most lethal flying machine. This is the story of how one woman's courage in raising her hand would ripple through the halls of the Pentagon, challenge a military tradition spanning centuries, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. The question that started it all was simple. The answer would change everything. The morning of September 15, 2012, began like any other at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home to the 101st Airborne Division. The sun cast long shadows across the tarmac where rows of helicopters sat like sleeping giants, their rotors still and silent in the dawn air. But inside Building 4830, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Colonel James Morrison stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face bearing the lines of 25 years in military aviation. Behind him, a large screen displayed satellite images of a remote mountainous region in Afghanistan. The photo showed a compound nestled among jagged peaks, surrounded by what intelligence reports suggested were heavily fortified positions. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of countless missions and hard-won experience, "what you're looking at is our target. Intelligence indicates this is where they're holding Lieutenant Colonel David Richards and his crew. They've been missing for 72 hours. The room was filled with some of the most skilled pilots in the Army. Captain Mike Sullivan, a Black Hawk pilot with 3 tours under his belt, sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on the screen. Behind him, Major Tom Bradley, a Chinook veteran who had flown countless missions in Iraq, leaned forward intently. These were men who had seen combat, who had brought soldiers home from impossible situations, who had earned their place in this room through skill, dedication, and courage. But as Morrison continued his briefing, it became clear that this mission would require something different, something none of them could provide. "The terrain is extremely challenging," Morrison explained, pointing to the satellite imagery. "We're talking about operating at 9,000 feet elevation in narrow mountain passes with limited landing zones. The enemy has positioned anti-aircraft weapons throughout the valley, and our intelligence suggests they have shoulder-fired missiles." Captain Sarah Chen sat in the back corner of the room, taking notes in her worn leather notebook. At 28, she was one of the youngest pilots present, and certainly the only woman. Her flight suit was regulation perfect, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that met military standards. She had learned early in her career that being noticed for the wrong reasons could be career-ending. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a mechanic and a nurse. Her father had taught her to fix engines before she could properly ride a bicycle, and her mother had instilled in her the importance of helping others. When she announced her intention to join the Army and become a pilot, her parents were supportive but worried. The military was changing, slowly allowing women into more roles, but combat aviation was still largely a man's domain. "This is where it gets complicated," Morrison continued. "The rescue zone is heavily defended. Our down crew is being held in a fortified position that's been reinforced since they were captured. Getting them out is going to require precision strikes to neutralize the defenses before our extraction team can get in." The colonel paused, letting his words sink in. Around the room, pilots shifted in their seats. They all knew what was coming next. For this mission to succeed, we need someone who can fly a nap of the earth in those mountains, Someone who can make precision strikes in extremely tight quarters. Someone who can operate the most advanced weapon systems we have while flying in conditions that would challenge any pilot. Morrison's eyes swept the room, making contact with each of the assembled aviators. "We need an Apache pilot." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched as the confident expressions on her fellow pilots' faces shifted to uncertainty, then to something approaching embarrassment. These were men who could fly anything, who had trained on multiple aircraft types, who prided themselves on their versatility, but the Apache was different. The AHS 6-4 Apache was not just a helicopter. It was a flying weapons platform that demanded a level of specialization that few pilots ever achieved. It required hundreds of hours of specific training, constant practice, and a partnership between pilot and co-pilot gunner that bordered on telepathic. The Apache pilot sat in the back seat, flying the aircraft while the co-pilot gunner in front operated the weapon systems. Both positions required extensive training, and both pilots needed to be qualified to perform either role. Captain Sullivan, usually the first to volunteer for dangerous missions, found himself staring at his hands. His Black Hawk experience, impressive as it was, hadn't prepared him for the Apache's complexity. The weapon systems alone required months of training to master, and the flight characteristics of the heavily armed attack helicopter were completely different from anything he had flown. Major Bradley, equally accomplished in his own aircraft, felt the same uncertainty. The Chinook was a workhorse, capable of carrying heavy loads and operating in difficult conditions, but it was a transport helicopter. The Apache was a predator, designed for one purpose, to find the enemy and destroy them with devastating precision. Morrison waited, hoping someone would speak up, would claim the qualification that could make this mission possible. He knew the men in this room had flown with many of them, trusted them with his life. But he also knew that the Apache was a specialized beast that demanded specialized training. "The timeline is critical," he continued, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Every hour we wait increases the risk to our captured personnel. The weather window we have is narrow, and intelligence suggests the enemy may be planning to move the prisoners to a location where rescue would be impossible." Sarah felt her heart racing. She had been in situations like this before, where she had the answer to a problem but wasn't sure if speaking up was the right choice. In her 5 years of service, she had learned to be careful about when and how she asserted herself. Being the only woman in most situations meant that every action was scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every success questioned. She thought about her training at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where she had spent 18 months learning to fly the Apache. The instructors had been skeptical at first. Women were technically allowed to fly combat helicopters, but the reality was that very few had made it through the rigorous training program. The physical demands were intense, the mental pressure enormous, and the cultural resistance significant. But Sarah had persevered. She had outperformed many of her male classmates, had graduated in the top 10% of her class, and had been certified as both pilot and co-pilot gunner. She had spent countless hours in simulators, had fired thousands of rounds from the Apache's 30mm chain gun, and had mastered the complex Hellfire missile system that could strike targets with surgical precision. Yet, as she sat in that briefing room, listening to the silence stretch on, she wrestled with the decision that would define her career. Speaking up meant putting herself forward for one of the most dangerous missions the unit had faced. It meant becoming the center of attention in a way that made her uncomfortable. It meant risking failure in front of everyone who already questioned whether women belonged in combat aviation. But it also meant that 3 captured soldiers might have a chance to come home. Morrison was growing visibly frustrated. He had called this meeting believing he could quickly identify qualified Apache pilots and begin mission planning immediately. Instead, he was facing the possibility of having to delay the rescue while they brought in pilots from other units, precious time that might cost lives. "Let me be clear about what we're dealing with," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "The enemy position is in a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides. There are multiple anti-aircraft positions that need to be neutralized before the extraction team can enter. This requires precision strikes with Hellfire missiles, close air support with the 30mm gun, and the ability to operate in extremely confined spaces while under fire." He gestured to the tactical map displayed on the screen. "The approach route requires flying through mountain passes at high speed, low altitude, while avoiding known missile sites. Once in the target area, the Apache will need to identify and engage multiple targets while providing cover for the ground rescue team. This is not a mission for someone learning on the job." The weight of what he was describing settled over the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about flying a helicopter. It was about operating one of the most complex weapon systems in the world, under combat conditions that would test every skill an Apache pilot possessed. Sarah's mind raced through her training and experience. She had logged over 400 hours in the Apache, including night operations and high-altitude mountain flying. She had qualified expert on all weapon systems and had completed advanced tactical training that covered exactly the type of mission Morrison was describing. She had trained for this scenario dozens of times, though always in simulators or exercises. But this was real. This was 3 soldiers whose lives hung in the balance. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Some of the pilots began shifting in their seats, glancing at each other with expressions that mixed embarrassment with frustration. They were used to being the solution to problems, not the reason missions couldn't proceed. Morrison checked his watch. Time was running out, and he was going to have to make the call to higher headquarters that would delay the mission while they brought in qualified pilots from other bases. It wasn't what he wanted to report, especially when lives were at stake. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Richards and his crew, somewhere in those mountains, counting on people like her to bring them home. She thought about all the training she had endured, all the doubts she had overcome, all the time she had proven herself only to face the same skepticism again. She thought about why she had become a pilot in the first place, to serve her country and to save lives when others couldn't. Slowly, carefully, with every eye in the room beginning to turn toward any movement, Sarah Chen raised her hand. The room fell into an even deeper silence, if such a thing were possible. Morrison's eyes found hers across the briefing room, and she saw something flicker in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Surprise, certainly. Perhaps relief. Maybe something else entirely. Captain Chen, Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Are you saying you're qualified to fly the Apache? Sarah stood up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Yes, sir. I'm fully qualified as both pilot and co-pilot gunner on the HH-6. 4. I've completed all tactical certifications and I'm current on all weapon systems. The room remained silent, but she could feel the weight of dozens of stares. Some were skeptical, others curious, a few openly doubtful. She had expected this reaction, had prepared for it mentally many times over the years. Morrison studied her for a long moment. He knew Sarah's record, knew she was a capable pilot, but he also knew the political implications of what was happening. Sending the only woman in the room on a high-risk combat mission would generate questions from every level of command. If something went wrong, the second-guessing would be enormous. But he also knew that 3 soldiers were depending on him to make the right decision, not the safe one. Captain, this isn't a training exercise, he said, his tone making it clear he was giving her one last chance to reconsider. This is a direct action mission into heavily defended territory. The risk level is extreme. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. I understand, sir. I'm ready. What happened next would change not just the course of the rescue mission, but the trajectory of Sarah's career and the perception of what women could accomplish in military aviation. The hand that had risen in that moment of silence would soon be gripping the controls of one of the world's most lethal aircraft, carrying the hopes of 3 captured soldiers and the weight of proving that courage and skill knew no gender. At first, there would be questions, doubts, and preparations that would test everything Sarah thought she knew about herself and her chosen profession. The silence had been broken, but the real challenge was just beginning. The aftermath of Sarah's declaration hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Colonel Morrison studied her face for what felt like an eternity, searching for any sign of uncertainty or bravado. What he saw instead was the steady gaze of a professional aviator who understood exactly what she was volunteering for. Captain Chen, remain after the briefing, Morrison said finally. Everyone else dismissed. Mission planning will resume at 1400 hours. SF. The other pilots filed out of the room in unusual quiet, their conversations muted and their glances frequent towards Sarah. She remained standing at attention until the last person left and the door clicked shut, leaving her alone with the colonel. Morrison walked to the window that overlooked the flight line, where Apache helicopters sat in neat rows like predatory birds at rest. Their sleek, angular silhouettes spoke of purpose and power. Machines designed for a single mission: to locate, engage, and destroy enemy forces with devastating precision. Sarah, he said, dropping the formal rank for a moment, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She remained at attention. Yes, sir. Are you doing this because you're the only qualified pilot available, or because you want to prove something? He turned back to face her. Because if it's the latter, this isn't the place for it. 3 lives are hanging in the balance. Sarah had expected this question, had prepared for it during her years of service. Sir, I volunteered because I'm qualified and because those soldiers need someone who can bring them home. Nothing more, nothing less. Morrison nodded slowly. He had commanded enough soldiers to recognize sincerity when he heard it. Walk me through your qualifications. I completed Apache training at Fort Rucker 18 months ago. Graduated third in my class of 26 pilots. I've logged 427 hours in the HF. 6-4, including 78 hours of night operations and 45 hours of mountain flying. I'm qualified expert on all weapon systems, including Hellfire missiles, Hydra rockets, and the 30mm chain gun. I've completed advanced tactical training and I'm current on all certifications. Combat experience? Sarah paused. This was the question she had dreaded, the one weakness in her otherwise solid resume. No direct combat experience in the Apache, sir. I've flown support missions in Afghanistan, but no direct engagement with enemy forces. Morrison was quiet for a moment. In a perfect world, he would have an Apache pilot with hundreds of combat hours, someone who had proven themselves under fire. But this wasn't a perfect world, and sometimes you had to work with what you had. Who would you want as your co-pilot gunner? This was a crucial question. The Apache required perfect coordination between pilot and gunner, a partnership that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Sarah had given this considerable thought during the briefing. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, if he's available. We've flown together in training exercises, and he has combat experience in Iraq. He knows the weapons systems better than anyone in the unit. Morrison knew Rodriguez, a quiet professional with over a decade of experience in attack aviation. If anyone could work with an untested pilot on a high-risk mission, it would be him. I'm going to make some calls, Morrison said. In the meantime, I want you to go through every manual, every checklist, every tactical procedure we have for this type of mission. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Yes, sir. And Sarah? She looked up at him. The moment you have any doubts, any concerns about your ability to complete this mission, you tell me. No heroics, no trying to tough it out. Too many lives depend on getting this right. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in the unit's tactical planning room, surrounded by manuals, maps, and computer screens displaying detailed intelligence about the target area. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez Rodriguez sat across from her, his weathered face serious as they reviewed the mission parameters. Rodriguez was 30 years old and had been flying attack helicopters since Sarah was in high school. He had completed 2 tours in Iraq where he had earned a reputation as one of the best gunners in the army. He was also known for his direct no-nonsense approach to flying and his zero tolerance for anything less than perfection. Captain, he said without looking up from the topographical map spread between them, I need to know something before we go any further. Sarah had been expecting this conversation as well. Go ahead, Chief. Are you looking for a wingman or a babysitter? Because I'm not interested in the second option. She appreciated his directness. I'm looking for a partner. Someone who knows these systems better than I do and isn't afraid to speak up when they see something I don't. Rodriguez finally looked up at her, his dark eyes studying her face. You understand that if this goes wrong, it's not just our lives on the line? Those captured soldiers are counting on us to get it right the first time. There are no do-overs in combat. I understand. Good. He turned his attention back to the maps. Then let's talk about what we're really dealing with here. Rodriguez pulled out a series of aerial photographs showing the target compound from different angles. This is not going to be a straightforward attack run. The compound is built into the side of a mountain, with natural and man-made defensive positions covering all the obvious approach routes. He pointed to various features in the photos. Here, here, and here, we have confirmed anti-aircraft positions. Intelligence suggests they have shoulder-fired missiles, probably Soviet-era SAR-7s or similar. They're not the most sophisticated, but they're deadly against helicopters if you give them a clear shot. Sarah studied the terrain carefully. The target was indeed built into a mountainside, with steep terrain on all sides and limited maneuvering space. The approach routes were narrow valleys that would funnel any attacking aircraft into predictable paths, exactly where the defenders would expect them. The rescue team will be inserting here, Rodriguez continued, indicating a position about 2 kilometers from the main compound. They'll need us to neutralize the defensive positions before they can move in, and then provide close air support during the extraction. What's the timeline from first contact to extraction? 15 minutes maximum. Intel says the enemy has reinforcements within 20 minutes of the compound, so we need to get in, complete the mission, and get everyone out before they arrive. Sarah felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that came with complex tactical problems. This was why she had become a pilot, for moments when skill and training and courage all came together to accomplish something that seemed impossible. "Let's talk weapons load," Rodriguez said, pulling out another set of specifications. "We'll be carrying 8 Hellfire missiles, 38 Hydra rockets, and 1,200 rounds for the chain gun. The Hellfires are for the hardened positions, the Hydras for area targets, and the gun for close support and cleanup." They spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of the mission: approach routes, target priorities, communication protocols, emergency procedures, and extraction plans.
Rodriguez tested Sarah's knowledge of weapons systems,
navigation procedures, and emergency protocols with the intensity of a final exam. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to sense a subtle shift in Rodriguez's attitude. His questions became less challenging and more collaborative. His suggestions more detailed and helpful. She realized he was beginning to see her as a partner rather than a problem. "One more thing," Rodriguez said as they prepared to break for dinner. "The enemy knows we're coming." Sarah looked up sharply. "What do you mean? They captured our people 3 days ago, and they've had time to prepare. They know we'll attempt a rescue, and they've positioned themselves accordingly. This isn't going to be a surprise attack against an unprepared enemy. They're waiting for us." This changed the tactical picture significantly. Instead of catching the enemy off guard, they would be flying into a prepared defensive position with limited escape routes and multiple threats. The mission had just become considerably more dangerous. "Are you having second thoughts, Captain?" Sarah considered the question seriously. The smart answer might be yes. The safe answer would definitely be yes. But as she thought about 3 soldiers sitting in captivity, she knew there was only one answer she could live with. "No, Chief. Let's bring them home." That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment on base, reviewing mission materials and trying to quiet the voices in her head that questioned whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. She had trained for scenarios like this, had prepared for the possibility of combat, but the reality of knowingly flying into enemy fire was different from anything she had experienced. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're doing well. Love you." Sarah stared at the message, realizing she couldn't tell her family about the mission, couldn't share the weight of what she was preparing to do. They would learn about it afterward, if everything went well, or perhaps never if things went badly. She thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, the countless hours of training, the skepticism she had faced, the small victories and large obstacles that had defined her military career. Everything had led to this opportunity to prove herself in the most demanding environment imaginable. At 2200 hours, she received a call from Colonel Morrison. "Captain, I've received approval for the mission. We launch at 0530 tomorrow morning. Are you ready?" Sarah looked around her small apartment, at the flight manuals scattered across her coffee table, at the tactical maps she had been studying. She thought about Rodriguez and their afternoon of planning, about the captured soldiers waiting for rescue, about the moment in the briefing room when she had raised her hand. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." After she hung up, Sarah spent another hour reviewing emergency procedures and memorizing the details of their planned approach routes. She knew that by this time tomorrow she would either be celebrating the successful rescue of 3 American soldiers or dealing with consequences she didn't want to contemplate. But as she finally turned off the lights and tried to sleep, one thought dominated her mind. Tomorrow, she would find out if all the training, all the preparation, all the belief in herself had been enough. Tomorrow, she would discover what she was really made of. The Apache pilot's present question had been answered. Now it was time to prove that the answer had been the right one. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Sarah had managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep before her alarm sounded at 0430 hours. As she dressed in her flight suit, she went through her pre-mission routine with mechanical precision, the same rituals that had become second nature over years of flying. The flight line buzzed with quiet activity as ground crews performed final checks on the aircraft. Sarah's Apache, tail number 07, 03241, sat ready under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hangar. The sleek attack helicopter looked predatory even at rest, its sensor turret giving it an insect-like appearance that was both alien and intimidating. Chief Rodriguez was already conducting his pre-flight inspection when Sarah arrived, walking around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, checking every panel, every antenna, every weapon mount. She joined him in the ritual, both pilots verifying that their lives would be entrusted to a machine that was functioning perfectly. "Sleep well?" Rodriguez asked as they checked the Hellfire missiles mounted on the aircraft's stub wings. "Like a baby," Sarah lied, examining the connection points on one of the missiles. The Hellfire was a precision weapon capable of destroying tanks or buildings with surgical accuracy, assuming the person firing it knew what they were doing. Good, because we're going to need every advantage we can get. Rodriguez's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the tension underneath. Even experienced pilots felt pre-mission nerves, especially when the stakes were this high. Colonel Morrison appeared as they finished their inspection, accompanied by Captain Williams, the mission commander who would be leading the ground rescue team. Williams was a special operations officer whose weathered face spoke of countless dangerous missions. Latest intelligence update, Morrison said, handing Sarah a folder. The weather window is holding, but it's going to be tight. You'll have maybe 30 minutes of clear visibility before the next front moves through. Sarah scanned the intelligence briefing. The enemy had indeed been busy during the night, reinforcing their positions and moving additional personnel into the area. What had been a challenging mission was becoming increasingly dangerous with each passing hour. The good news, Williams added, is that we've confirmed the location of our personnel. They're being held in the main building, second floor, northeast corner. Once you neutralize the defensive positions, my team will need exactly 8 minutes to reach them and initiate extraction. 8 minutes. Sarah filed away the number, knowing that her job would be to keep enemy forces suppressed for every second of that time, regardless of what they threw at her in return. One more thing, Morrison said, his expression serious. Higher headquarters is monitoring this mission closely. There will be questions afterward, regardless of outcome. But right now, those 3 soldiers are depending on all of us to do our jobs. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. As the only woman on this mission, her performance would be scrutinized more intensely than anyone else's. Success would be attributed to luck. Failure would be blamed on her gender. It was unfair, but it was reality. At 0525 hours, Sarah strapped herself into the rear seat of the Apache, where the pilot flew the aircraft while the co-pilot gunner in front operated the weapon systems. The cockpit was a tight fit, surrounded by displays, controls, and switches that controlled one of the most sophisticated weapons platforms ever built. Rodriguez settled into the front seat, immediately beginning the process of bringing the aircraft systems online. The Apache's computers began their startup sequence with a series of electronic sounds that reminded Sarah of a science fiction movie. Except this was very real and very deadly. Apache 27, this is Tower. You are cleared for takeoff, came the voice through their headsets. 27 airborne. Rodriguez replied as Sarah lifted the aircraft smoothly off the ground. The flight to the target area would take 45 minutes, following a route that kept them away from populated areas and potential observation points. As they flew through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of becoming one with the machine, her movements translating instantly into the aircraft's responses. They flew low and fast, following valleys and ridgelines to mask their approach. The terrain below them gradually changed from the familiar forests of Kentucky to the stark, mountainous landscape they had studied in photographs. Here, the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, creating a maze of valleys and canyons that could hide an army. 30 minutes to target, Rodriguez announced, his voice calm and professional, despite what they were flying toward. Sarah began running through her mental checklist of weapon systems and emergency procedures. Everything had to be perfect when they reached the target area. There would be no time for second-guessing or hesitation once the shooting started. Apache 27, this is Overwatch, came a new voice over the radio. Somewhere above them, an unmanned surveillance aircraft was providing real-time intelligence about the target area. Current count shows 12 enemy personnel visible, 6 in fighting positions, 6 mobile. Anti-aircraft positions are manned and active. 27 copies, Sarah replied. 12 enemies was more than they had expected, but still manageable if everything went according to plan. The landscape below them became increasingly hostile as they approached the target area. The valleys narrowed, the peaks rose higher, and the number of places where things could go wrong multiplied exponentially. This was terrain that favored the defender, where a single well-placed missile could end their mission before it really began. 10 minutes to target, Rodriguez announced. Weapons systems are hot and ready. Sarah felt her heart rate increase despite her training and experience. In 10 minutes, she would be engaging enemy forces in actual combat for the first time in her career. Everything she had learned, everything she had prepared for, would be tested against people who were trying to kill her. Apache 27, this is Rescue 16, came Captain Williams's voice over the radio. The ground team was in position, waiting for Sarah and Rodriguez to clear the way for their assault. 27 standing by, Sarah replied, forcing her voice to remain steady and professional. Target area in sight, Rodriguez called out from the front seat. Sarah could see the compound ahead, built into the mountainside, exactly as the photographs had shown. Smoke was rising from several points around the perimeter, and she could see movement as enemy forces prepared for the attack they knew was coming. This was the moment when months of training would meet the reality of combat, when theoretical knowledge would be tested against actual bullets and missiles. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to find out if she was truly ready for what came next. Apache 27 beginning attack run, she announced over the radio, her voice cutting through the static with calm professionalism. The first phase of the mission called for them to neutralize the anti-aircraft positions before the ground team could advance. Sarah banked the Apache sharply to the left, using a ridgeline to mask their approach to the first target. Target in sight, Rodriguez called out. Hellfire missile selected, waiting for your call. Sarah maneuvered the aircraft to give Rodriguez a clear shot while staying low enough to avoid enemy radar. Through her display, she could see the enemy position clearly, a reinforced bunker with what appeared to be a shoulder-fired missile system. You have clearance to engage, she said, the words marking the moment when their mission transformed from planning to combat. The Hellfire missile launched with a sharp crack and a trail of smoke streaking across the valley toward its target. Sarah watched its flight path on her display, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether their mission proceeded smoothly or descended into chaos. The missile struck the bunker with devastating precision, sending up a column of flame and debris. The explosion echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, announcing to everyone in the area that the battle had begun. Direct hit, target destroyed, Rodriguez reported with professional satisfaction. But Sarah's attention was already shifting to their next objective. Even as they celebrated their first success, she could see enemy forces scrambling to respond to their attack. Figures were running between buildings, taking up new positions, preparing to make the rest of their mission as difficult as possible. Second target, 2 o'clock, Rodriguez called out. Sarah swung the Apache around to engage the next anti-aircraft position, but as she lined up for the shot, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure on the ground was raising what looked like a shoulder-fired missile, aiming directly at their aircraft. Missile launch, she called out, throwing the Apache into a sharp evasive maneuver just as a streak of fire rose from the ground toward their position. The enemy missile passed close enough that Sarah could see it through her canopy, a reminder of how quickly success could turn to disaster in combat. She continued her evasive maneuvers while Rodriguez worked to acquire their next target. I've got him, Rodriguez said, his voice tight with concentration. Another Hellfire missile launched, this one targeting the position that had nearly shut them down. The explosion eliminated the immediate threat, but Sarah could see more enemy forces moving into position. What was supposed to have been a quick series of precision strikes was turning into a running gun battle with an enemy that was better prepared than intelligence had suggested. Apache 27, this is Rescue 16. Williams's voice crackled over the radio. We need that suppression fire. We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Sarah looked down at the compound where the ground team was trying to advance toward the building holding the captured Americans. Muzzle flashes were visible from several windows and defensive positions, creating a deadly crossfire that was preventing the rescue team from reaching their objective. 27 engaging with 30mm, Sarah announced, bringing the Apache's nose around to bear on the enemy positions. This was where her training in close air support would be tested. She had to provide accurate fire that would suppress the enemy without endangering the friendly forces advancing below. It required precision flying combined with split-second timing, all while under fire from an enemy that was doing everything possible to shoot her down. Rodriguez opened fire with the Apache's 30mm chain gun, sending high-explosive rounds into the enemy positions with devastating effect. The weapon fired at a rate of 750 rounds per minute, each round capable of destroying light vehicles or fortified positions. Sarah maneuvered the aircraft to give Rodriguez clear lines of fire while staying mobile enough to avoid enemy missiles. It was a deadly dance performed at 100 miles per hour, with the lives of the ground team depending on their ability to execute it perfectly. Good effect on target, Williams reported. We're advancing to the building. But Sarah could see more enemy forces moving to intercept the ground team, including what looked like a technical vehicle with a heavy machine gun mounted in the back. If that weapon got into position, it could devastate Williams and his men. Rodriguez, armored vehicle, you're 10 o'clock, she called out. I see it. Engaging with Hellfire. The missile streaked across the battlefield and struck the vehicle dead center, eliminating the threat in a spectacular explosion. But the enemy was adapting to their tactics, and Sarah could see more forces moving into positions where they could threaten both the ground team and her aircraft. This was no longer the quick surgical strike they had planned. It was becoming a full-scale battle, with the outcome far from certain and the margin for error shrinking with each passing minute. The real test of Sarah's skills and determination was just beginning. The battle was not going according to plan. What intelligence had described as a dozen enemy fighters had turned into what seemed like half an army, with reinforcements arriving faster than expected and from directions that hadn't appeared on any of their maps. Sarah banked the Apache hard left as another missile streaked past their aircraft, close enough that she could feel the heat wash over the cockpit. The enemy was learning to anticipate their attack patterns, making each successive run more dangerous than the last. Rescue 1-6, what's your status? She called into the radio while executing another evasive maneuver. Still advancing, Williams replied, but Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. Heavy resistance on the second floor. We've located our people, but we need more time to extract them safely. More time was exactly what they didn't have. Sarah could see dust clouds on the mountain roads that indicated enemy reinforcements were approaching fast. According to their intelligence timeline, they should have been long gone by now. Apache 2-7, this is Overwatch, came the voice from the surveillance aircraft overhead. Multiple vehicles approaching from the northeast, estimated 12 minutes to target area. 12 minutes before they would be facing overwhelming odds. 12 minutes to complete the rescue and get everyone out safely. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with impossible situations, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Rodriguez, we need to speed this up, she said, scanning the battlefield for targets that would help the ground team most. Working on it, he replied, his voice tight with concentration. The Apache's 30mm gun spoke again, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into an enemy position that was pinning down part of Williams' team. But just as Rodriguez's burst found its target, Sarah heard a sound that every pilot dreaded, the harsh buzz of a missile warning system. Someone on the ground had achieved a radar lock on their aircraft. "Incoming missile!" she shouted, throwing the Apache into the most aggressive, evasive maneuver she had ever attempted. The aircraft dove toward the valley floor while Sarah fired chaff and flares to confuse any heat-seeking weapons that might be tracking them. G-forces pressed against both pilots as the helicopter twisted through the air in patterns designed to break missile locks. The enemy missile exploded harmlessly behind them, but Sarah realized they had a serious problem. The enemy had brought up more sophisticated weapons than intelligence had indicated, probably radar-guided systems that were much harder to evade than the shoulder-fired missiles they had been expecting. 2-7, we've lost our element of surprise, Rodriguez said, stating what they both already knew. They're bringing up everything they have. Sarah pulled the Apache out of its dive and immediately began scanning for the source of the missile launch. Somewhere down there was a weapons system that could kill them if they gave it another clear shot. There, Rodriguez called out, pointing to a position on the ridgeline where Sarah could see the distinctive shape of a mobile air defense system. That's what locked onto us. The enemy had positioned the weapon cleverly, using the terrain to mask it until the last moment. Now it was tracking their aircraft, waiting for another opportunity to engage. "Can you hit it with a Hellfire?" Sarah asked while maneuvering to stay out of the weapon's engagement envelope. "Negative, too much terrain between us. We'll have to get closer." Getting closer meant exposing themselves to the very weapon that was trying to kill them, but they had no choice. As long as that air defense system was operational, their ability to support the ground team was severely compromised. Sarah began a complex approach pattern that would bring them within range while minimizing their exposure time. It required precision flying that left no room for error, threading the needle between mountain peaks while staying below the enemy's radar horizon. "Rescue 1-6, be advised we're dealing with upgraded enemy air defenses," she called to Williams. "We may have to temporarily reduce fire support while we eliminate the threat." "Understood, 2-7. We're almost to the target room. Give us 3 more minutes." 3 minutes felt like an eternity, when every second brought enemy reinforcements closer to the battlefield. Sarah could see the dust clouds getting larger as vehicles raced along the mountain roads toward their position. She brought the Apache around for their attack run on the air defense system, flying at maximum speed just above the valley floor. The enemy weapon tracked their movement, but Sarah's approach angle made it difficult for them to achieve a firing solution. "In range now," Rodriguez announced. "Hellfire selected and ready." "Take the shot," Sarah ordered. The missile launched and streaked toward the enemy position, but Sarah had to continue flying directly toward the air defense system until the weapon hit its target. For those few seconds, they were completely exposed to enemy fire, with nowhere to hide if the Hellfire missed. The explosion that followed was larger than expected, suggesting that the enemy weapon had been fully loaded with ammunition when it was destroyed. Secondary explosions continued for several seconds as stored missiles and rockets detonated. Target destroyed, Rodriguez reported with evident satisfaction. But their victory was short-lived. Even as they celebrated eliminating the air defense threat, Sarah could see that the first enemy reinforcements had reached the compound perimeter. Fresh troops were deploying from vehicles, setting up new weapons positions, and preparing to overwhelm the small rescue team. Rescue 1-6, this is 2-7. You've got company arriving at your 6 o'clock, she warned. Copy that.
We've got our people and we're moving to the extraction point now, Williams replied. But we're going to need heavy suppression fire to get out of here.
Sarah could see the rescue team emerging from the main building, carrying or supporting the 3 rescued soldiers, who appeared to be alive but in poor condition.
The group was moving slowly across the compound toward their designated pickup zone, but enemy forces were converging on their position from multiple directions. This was the most critical phase of the entire mission. The rescue team was exposed in the open, moving at the speed of their weakest member, while enemy forces with superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain were trying to cut them off. Sarah brought the Apache down to minimum altitude and began making gun runs against the converging enemy forces. The 30mm cannon was devastating against personnel in the open, but there were too many targets and not enough time to engage them all. Rodriguez, we need to be smart about this, she said while lining up another gun run.
Priority targets are anything that can stop the rescue team from reaching the extraction point. Roger that.
I see a machine gun team setting up in that building.
Engaging now. The Apache's cannon spoke again, and the enemy machine gun position disappeared in a shower of concrete and steel. But Sarah could see more enemies moving into position, including what looked like mortar teams that could rain indirect fire down on the rescue team. The sound of rotor blades echoed off the mountain walls as the extraction helicopters approached the pickup zone. Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this mission ended in success or disaster. Extraction birds inbound.
Came the call over the radio.
2 minutes to pick up. 2 minutes to keep overwhelming enemy forces away from a handful of exhausted soldiers carrying their rescued comrades. 2 minutes to prove that all of Sarah's training and Rodriguez's experience could overcome impossible odds. But as she maneuvered for another gun run, Sarah saw something that made her heart sink. A group of enemy soldiers had reached the extraction zone first and were setting up what looked like anti-aircraft weapons aimed directly at where the rescue helicopters would have to land. If those weapons achieved firing positions, the extraction helicopters would be sitting ducks. The entire rescue mission would fail, and everyone involved would likely be killed or captured. Rodriguez, do you see the extraction zone? Yeah, I see it. We've got a problem. Sarah made a decision that went against every rule of engagement and safety protocol she had ever learned. Instead of making another careful attack run from a safe distance, she dove the Apache directly toward the enemy position, flying straight into their field of fire. What are you doing? Rodriguez called out. Clearing the landing zone, Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the fact that she was flying directly toward multiple weapon positions that were now turning their attention toward her aircraft. The Apache screamed down toward the extraction zone at maximum speed, enemy tracer rounds reaching up toward them like deadly fireworks. Sarah could hear impacts on the aircraft's armor as bullets found their mark, but she continued her dive until the enemy position filled her entire field of vision. Gun run, danger close. Rodriguez called out, warning everyone in the area that he was about to fire almost directly over the heads of friendly forces. The 30mm cannon opened fire at point-blank range, devastating the enemy position and clearing the way for the extraction helicopters. But as Sarah pulled out of her dive, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the harsh grinding noise of damaged aircraft systems. Warning lights were illuminating across her instrument panel, and the Apache was developing a vibration that suggested serious mechanical damage. They had taken more hits during that final gun run than the aircraft could handle. We've got problems, Rodriguez announced, his voice tight with concern. Hydraulic pressure is dropping, and I'm seeing warning lights I don't like. Sarah fought to maintain control of the aircraft as its flight characteristics changed. The Apache was still flying, but barely, and she knew they needed to get clear of the combat area before their situation became critical. Below them, the extraction helicopters were touching down in the zone that Sarah had just cleared with her desperate gun run. She could see the rescue team loading the recovered soldiers aboard the aircraft, their mission finally nearing completion. But Sarah's own situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Apache was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and she could see fluids streaming from damaged hydraulic lines. They had perhaps minutes before the aircraft became unflyable. The question now was whether those minutes would be enough to get them home safely, or whether their rescue of 3 soldiers would cost the lives of 2 more. The Apache limped through the mountain passes like a wounded bird, its damaged systems creating a symphony of warning tones and vibrations that grew worse with each passing mile. Sarah fought the controls as hydraulic fluid continued to stream from bullet holes in the aircraft's fuselage, each drop representing a little less control over their fate. "How far to the emergency landing zone?" Rodriguez asked, his voice steady despite their deteriorating situation. Sarah checked their navigation system with one eye while scanning for suitable landing areas with the other. 15 miles to the primary site, but I don't think we're going to make it that far. The Apache shuddered as another hydraulic system failed, and Sarah felt the controls become noticeably heavier in her hands. She was now flying the aircraft through pure muscle power, fighting mechanical systems that were designed to operate with hydraulic assistance. "Rescue 1-6, this is Apache 2-7, she called over the radio. "Be advised, we took multiple hits during the final gun run. We're experiencing significant aircraft damage and may need to execute an emergency landing." 2-7, this is Rescue 1-6, Williams replied. His team was safely aboard the extraction helicopters, but Sarah could hear the concern in his voice. "What's your status?"
Flyable for now, but degrading rapidly.
"We're going to try to make it to the emergency site, but wanted to give you a heads up in case we go down short." Sarah didn't mention that going down short in these mountains would likely mean death for both her and Rodriguez. The terrain below them was unforgiving, with no suitable emergency landing areas and enemy forces still active throughout the region. "Understood, 2-7. We're coordinating search and rescue assets in case you need them." Rodriguez was methodically working through his emergency checklists, shutting down damaged systems and trying to preserve whatever control they still had. "Primary hydraulics are gone," he reported. "Secondary system is holding for now, but pressure is dropping steadily." Sarah nodded, focusing all her attention on keeping the Apache airborne. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input required significant physical effort, and she could already feel fatigue building in her arms and shoulders. Flying a damaged aircraft was exhausting work under the best of circumstances. The radio crackled with a new voice. "Apache 2-7, this is Castle Base Operations. We have emergency crews standing by and medical personnel on alert. What are your aircraft capabilities?" Sarah considered how to answer that question honestly. The Apache was still flying, but barely. She had partial flight controls, limited visibility due to a cracked canopy, and warning lights that indicated multiple system failures. Most concerning was the continued loss of hydraulic fluid, which would eventually leave them with no flight controls at all. "Castle Base, we have partial flight controls and degraded systems. Estimated time to total hydraulic failure is 8 to 10 minutes. Request priority emergency handling." "Roger, 2-7. You are cleared direct to Castle Base. Emergency crews are standing by. Weather is clear, winds calm. You're cleared to land on any available surface." The controller's professional calm was reassuring, but Sarah knew that the next few minutes would be the most challenging flying of her career. Landing a heavily damaged military helicopter required skills that were difficult to practice and impossible to master without actually experiencing emergency situations.
There! Rodriguez called out, pointing ahead through the cracked canopy.
"I can see the base." Sarah followed his gaze and felt a surge of relief as she spotted the familiar layout of Castle Base emergency landing field. It was still several miles away, but for the first time since taking the hits, she began to believe they might actually make it. But the Apache had other ideas. As they approached the final valley before the base, the aircraft's remaining hydraulic system finally gave up completely. Sarah felt the flight controls go rigid in her hands, leaving her with only manual reversion to control their descent. "Total hydraulic failure," she announced, both to Rodriguez and to the base operations center. "We're coming in hard." Flying a helicopter without hydraulic assistance was like trying to steer a car without power steering while lifting weights. Every control input required maximum physical effort, and the aircraft's responses became sluggish and unpredictable. Sarah began her approach to the emergency field, knowing that she would have only one chance to get it right. A missed approach was not an option. They didn't have the power or control authority to go around for a second attempt. The Apache descended toward the landing field in a controlled crash, its damaged systems protesting every foot of the way down. Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves around the field, their flashing lights creating a pathway toward safety. "Rate of descent is high," Rodriguez called out, reading from instruments that Sarah couldn't spare attention to monitor. "You're doing great, just bring her down easy." Easy was a relative term when flying a machine that wanted to fall out of the sky. Sarah used every technique she had learned, every bit of experience she had gained, to coax the Apache toward the ground at something resembling a normal landing speed. The aircraft touched down harder than any landing Sarah had ever made, bouncing once before settling onto the emergency field with a grinding noise that suggested significant structural damage. But they were on the ground, they were alive, and the mission was complete. Emergency crews swarmed around the Apache before the rotors had even stopped spinning, checking for fire hazards and preparing to extract the crew if necessary. Sarah shut down the remaining systems, with hands that she was surprised to see shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Nice flying," Rodriguez said as they began their post-flight procedures. "I wasn't sure we were going to make it there for a while." Sarah looked at her co-pilot, this veteran warrior who had trusted her to get them home safely, despite having every reason to doubt an untested pilot. "Thanks for backing me up out there. I couldn't have done it without you." Colonel Morrison was waiting for them as they climbed out of the damaged aircraft. His expression was unreadable as he looked over the bullet holes and damage that marked their ordeal. "How do you feel, Captain?" he asked. Sarah considered the question while looking back at the Apache that had brought them home despite taking devastating damage. She thought about the rescued soldiers who were already receiving medical attention at a nearby facility. She thought about the moment in the briefing room when she had raised her hand, not knowing what it would lead to. "Like we did what we came to do, sir," she replied. Morrison nodded, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something that might have been pride in his expression. "The 3 soldiers you helped rescue are going to be fine. Minor injuries, dehydration, but they'll all make complete recoveries." Over the following weeks, the story of the rescue mission spread through military aviation circles with the speed of legend. The official after-action reports focused on tactical lessons learned and equipment performance, but the unofficial discussions centered on the performance of the pilot who had volunteered when no one else could. Sarah found herself dealing with attention she had never wanted and recognition that made her uncomfortable. Reporters wanted to interview her, military officials wanted to use her story for recruitment purposes, and fellow pilots looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity that she wasn't sure how to handle. But the moment that mattered most came 3 weeks after the mission, when she received a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Richards, the senior officer they had rescued from the mountain compound. "Captain Chen," the letter read, "I wanted to personally thank you for the courage and skill you demonstrated during our rescue. My crew and I are alive today because you were willing to step forward when others could not. Your actions reflect the highest traditions of military aviation and remind all of us that heroism comes in many forms. I am proud to serve in the same army as officers like you." Sarah read the letter several times, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or career advancement. 3 soldiers had gone home to their families because she had raised her hand when asked who could fly the Apache. Everything else was just noise. The damaged Apache was eventually repaired and returned to service, but not before Sarah had a chance to walk around the aircraft one more time. The bullet holes had been patched, the damaged systems replaced, and the scars of combat erased by skilled technicians. But Sarah remembered every moment of that mission, every decision that had led to their successful return. She had discovered something about herself in those mountains that no amount of training could have taught her. That when everything was on the line, when lives depended on her skills and courage, she could deliver. 6 months later, Sarah was promoted to major and selected for advanced training that would prepare her for even more challenging assignments. Her personnel file now included a combat action badge and a distinguished flying cross. Awards that marked her transformation from untested pilot to proven combat veteran. But more important than any decoration or promotion was the knowledge that she had found her answer to the question that had haunted her throughout her military career. Did she belong here? The answer had come not in the form of acceptance or approval from others, but in the moment when 3 American soldiers walked free from captivity because she had possessed the skills and courage to make it happen. In the end, that was all that mattered. When someone had asked any Apache pilot present, she had been able to say yes, and mean it in every possible way. The rest was just flying.